In 2008, a young Dzeeff went to the Crossroads of Chaos sneak peek. To my surprise, I pulled a secret rare overdrive teleporter out of my packs, and one of the older players saw that I pulled this card and he asked me what I would want if I was going to trade it. I asked him for 3 copies of every single Iron Chain card in the set, which I thought was a pretty fair deal. That's like 21 cards for only 1 card, right? So after like 5, maybe 10 minutes, he managed to get 3 copies of all of the Iron Chain cards, and we did the trade. Now later on, I found out, maybe like a week or 2 later, that Overdrive Teleporter was worth approximately $90 to $100 a copy, while the Iron Chain cards altogether were maybe worth $5. Despite this, I wasn't actually that mad at the time because, oh, at least I had my Iron Chain deck, but when I finally got a chance to take that Iron Chain deck to locals a few weeks later, I realized that Iron Chains weren't that good, and I pretty much have never played them since. That being said, the reason I'm telling you guys all this is because I want you to know that I really do like the Iron Chain archetype, despite it being pretty much complete garbage. In today's video, I wanted to go through all 7 of the Iron Chain cards and talk about why this archetype never saw competitive or honestly even casual play. There is one very good Iron Chain card that saw play a lot outside of the actual Iron Chain deck, and I'll mention that when we get to that card, but for the most part, this archetype is completely unplayable, and in today's video, we're going to go through all the cards to figure out why that is. The first card we're going to look at is Iron Chain Snake, a level 3 Earth Reptile effect monster with 800 attack and 1200 defense. Now realize that because these cards are from 2008, they obviously don't have to be nearly as powerful as modern day cards, but also remember that in the context of 2008, these cards were pretty bad back then as well. So this one says, during your main phase, you can equip this card to 1 face-up monster your opponent controls. That monster loses 800 attack and defense. When it is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, its controller sends cards equal to its level from the top of their deck to the graveyard. So this card isn't the worst Iron Chain card. You can kind of understand how it might be playable. You equip it to a big monster that your opponent has, and then when you run it over in battle, you mill a bunch of cards off the top of their deck. Makes sense, right? This obviously, just looking at this one card, seems like it's going to be a mill strategy. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the Iron Chain archetype can't really decide on what it actually wants to be. For example, let's take a look at the next card, Iron Chain Blaster, to show you guys what I'm talking about. Iron Chain Blaster is a level 2 Earth Warrior effect monster with 1100 attack and 0 defense. This card says once per turn you can send 1 Iron Chain monster you control to the graveyard to inflict 800 damage to your opponent. Wait a second here, why doesn't this card have a mill effect? Why does it have a burn effect instead? And this really is a case where you do not want to combine burn and mill in the same deck. Those are 2 very different win conditions, so this is kind of where you see the Iron Chain deck start to fall apart, and we're only 2 cards in. Iron Chain Snake is very obviously meant to help mill the opponent out of their entire deck, while Iron Chain Blaster seems to be some sort of burn support card. Next up, we have Iron Chain Coil, a level 3 Earth Machine Tuner monster with 1100 attack and 1600 defense. Maybe the tuner monster in the archetype will help us figure out what direction this deck is trying to take. Iron Chain Coil says once per turn you can select 1 Iron Chain monster you control to have it gain 300 attack and defense as long as this card is face up on the field. What is this card? I mean, it might as well be a vanilla monster. That effect is not very good, even by 2008 standards. So far, we have 3 cards that all have very different effects, and yeah, all 3 of these cards are obviously terrible, but what really set the Iron Chain archetype apart from the other pack filler archetypes of that era was that this one didn't really have a cohesive theme. There were plenty of bad archetypes back then. I mean, of course there were, but at least a lot of those those archetypes had a goal that they were trying to achieve. Next up, let's talk about Iron Chain Repairman. Now, admittedly, this is actually one of the better main deck Iron Chain cards. It probably is the best main deck Iron Chain card, but because of how bad the other cards in the archetype are, this one sadly isn't really that relevant. If the other Iron Chain cards, though, were good, this one probably would have seen play. Iron Chain Repairman is a level 4 Earth Warrior effect monster with 1600 attack and 1200 defense. This card says, when this card destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, inflict 300 damage to your opponent. Once per turn, you can special summon one level 4 or lower Iron Chain monster from your graveyard, except Iron Chain Repairman. This card cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. Now, modern day players might look at this card and go, oh, this card is clearly terrible, I don't know why you're singling it out. But compared to the other cards in 2008, we didn't see a lot of effects like this that could just special summon another monster from your graveyard basically for free. Yeah, this card can't attack the turn you use that effect, but who cares? You're probably using this card and the monster you revive for a synchro summon anyway. So while this card might look pretty terrible by modern standards, this type of ability was actually surprisingly rare back then. Keep in mind, at this point we hadn't even gotten Debris Dragon yet, so this card actually was pretty ahead of its time. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point that we have already seen every single main deck Iron Chain monster. So we have 2 cards that burn, although one of them is mainly just for revival, 1 card that mills for some reason, and 1 card that gives a very minor boost of attack and defense. So we don't really have a great direction for the deck, even though we've seen every main deck monster. But let's take a look at the boss monster, the big synchro summon that you're trying to go for. Now, keep in mind here, Iron Chain Repairman is level 4 and Iron Chain Coil, the deck's only tuner, is level 3, so naturally the boss monster should be a level 7 synchro, because otherwise Repairman looks a lot worse. So here's the synchro. Iron Chain Dragon, which you might immediately notice is not in fact a level 7 synchro, it is though a level 6 one. So this is actually the only Iron Chain card that ever saw competitive play, but like I said, it wasn't in actual Iron Chain decks. Those never got a chance to work. Iron Chain Dragon is a level 6 Earth Dragon synchro effect monster with 2500 attack and 1300 defense. This card is generically summonable with 1 tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters, and it says you can remove from play all Iron Chain monsters from your graveyard to have this card gain 200 attack for each card removed until the end phase. When this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, send the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. Now, I realize this boss monster might not look that impressive, and I will talk about why it saw competitive play in just a few moments here, but first I just wanted to highlight that if you are trying to summon this card in an Iron Chain deck, the only way to realistically do this is with Coil and Snake, 2 level 3 monsters. To me at least, it seems like there's a lot of disconnect between Iron Chain Repairman and Iron Chain Dragon. I like the idea of Iron Chain Repairman quite a bit. Back then, the concept of a 1 card level 7 synchro monster was pretty good, but as it stands right now, because Iron Chain Dragon is a level 6 monster, Repairman loses a lot of value. Yes, it is still a good card in the Iron Chain deck, and of course, these cards were released in Crossroads of Chaos, which had Black Rose Dragon, a very good level 7 synchro monster, but to me at least, it does seem pretty weird that Repairman can't actually go into Iron Chain Dragon. Anyway, why did Iron Chain Dragon see competitive play even if the Iron Chain archetype didn't? Well, for a long time, Iron Chain Dragon was the only generically summonable level 6 dragon synchro monster, and that meant when you had Debris Dragon and you revived a level 2 monster, Iron Chain Dragon was the only dragon you could make. There were some people that incorrectly assumed you could make Brionac Dragon of the Ice Barrier with Debris Dragon because Brionac does say dragon in its name, but for whatever reason, that card is actually a Sea Serpent monster, so you couldn't actually do that. That meant in pretty much every single deck playing Debris Dragon, you were going to play 1 copy of Iron Chain Dragon. And Debris Dragon was a very popular and extremely competitive card back in the day, so Iron Chain Dragon actually was pretty much everywhere as long as Debris Dragon was seen seeing competitive use. So this card, despite being part of a very bad archetype, managed to see a lot of competitive play basically because of what it was rather than what it actually did. The effect didn't really matter. I mean, yeah, the mill was kind of relevant sometimes, but in reality it was mainly played because it was a level 6 dragon synchro monster that you could summon using Debris Dragon. Anyway, there are still more Iron Chain cards to take a look at here. I will say that I am counting both of the next two cards as Iron Chain cards, but some people only count the first one because the other one is only loosely tied to them, but I personally count it as part of the archetype. So first up we have Poison Chain, a continuous spell card that says, during the end phase of your turn, if you did not attack, your opponent sends cards equal to the number of face-up Iron Chain monsters you control from the top of their deck to the graveyard. I mean, honestly, this is probably one of the slowest ways to mill an opponent. If you controlled 5 Iron Chain monsters and 1 copy of Poison Chain, you would only mill 5 cards during the end phase, and it was not easy to get 5 Iron Chain monsters on the board, especially back in 2008. Now, of course, Poison Chain does stack, so if you have multiple copies of Poison Chain, you'll mill a lot faster, but that wasn't really a reality. We're talking about a whole bunch of unsearchable cards, and keep in mind here that in 2008, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was pretty dang fast. We had all sorts of synchro summoning strategies that were taking over the metagame. You were never going to get 3 copies of Poison Chain on the board with 5 copies of Iron Chain monsters on the board. That was just not going to happen against any competent player, and honestly, it probably wouldn't even have worked against more casual opponents. This card is terrible, but let's move on to what is probably the worst card out of all of the Iron Chain support cards, even though, like I said, some people don't consider it part of the archetype. Personally, I do, and I think you'll see why. Paralyzing Chain is a continuous spell card that says, when a card or cards is sent from your opponent's deck to the graveyard by a card effect, inflict 300 damage to your opponent. This is easily one of the worst Yu-Gi-Oh cards in the entire game. Now, I get it, I'm sure some people will say that I'm exaggerating a bit here, but keep in mind that Paralyzing Chain does not deal 300 damage for each card milled if they are milled at the same time. What it means by when a card or cards is sent from your opponent's deck to the graveyard by a card effect is that if you mill, say, 5 cards at one time with a card like Poison Chain, Paralyzing Chain only deals 300 damage. So at this point, just in case you're not keeping score at home, we have 3 very bad burn cards, we have 2 very bad mill cards with 1 alright mill card with Iron Chain Dragon, and 1 card that for whatever reason gives monsters attack and defense. This is truly one of the most disjointed archetypes I have ever seen in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Iron Chains don't do milling well, they don't do burn well, and they don't really synchro summon that well either because Repairman is a level 4 and their boss monster is a level 6. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video talking about Iron Chains. I think this archetype is really neat, but of course it is absolutely terrible and it always has been. I would love to see like an Iron Chain Spellbook of Judgment card someday in the future that somehow ties everything together, but realistically I don't think that's going to happen. Surprisingly, maybe to some of you, none of these cards have been reprinted since Crossroads of Chaos, by the way, so clearly even Konami knows that these cards are absolute trash. I hope you guys enjoyed the video though. I'll see you later. Goodbye.